Call the Election Commission meeting to order. Clerk, please call the roll.
Commissioner Vining. Here. Germaini. Here. Lamore.
Here.
Felder. Whitman.
She's excused, and I see Commissioner Felder walking in.
Mayor Clark.
Here. Clerk, I know you have, I think, just a couple items here.
I really just have, two items. The first one is, we had an election chair call after we had made the appointments last meeting and cancel out on this election due to unforeseen circumstances. So that requires that we make another appointment. I'm asking the commission to appoint Jeanette Vanover as chair for 3 North. And she's also a member of my staff, so it's going to be an opportunity for her to cross-train as well and learn a little bit more on what happens in the field, so to speak, on election day. So if we could just have a motion to approve Jeanette as an election inspector for the March 10th presidential primary, we'll be all set.
Okay.
I'd like to make a motion that Jeanette Vanover be an election inspector for 3 North this upcoming election.
Support. Okay. Motion by Commissioner Lamore, support by Commissioner Felder. Clerk, call the roll, please.
Commissioner Angeli.
Yes.
Yes.
Germaini. Yes. Lamore.
Yes.
Felder.
Yes.
Mayor Clark.
Yes.
All right. And then the only other item I have is just a comment to remind those that committed to the public accuracy test. It will be March 3rd at 8 a.m. Here at City Hall, and I will send an email reminder. But wanted to just have that out there one more time. And that's all I have.
Any commissioner comments? I'm just going to add, as the follow-up to the clerk, that there are some other public accuracy tests will be coming up through the summer. We'll send that out because I know that I'll have a conflict on one of the later options just so we can check our calendars in the distance. So that's it. With that, guess the motion adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Support. Okay, this motion by Commissioner Lamore and Commissioner Felder. All in favor, say aye. Aye. We're adjourned.
Thank you. All right.
This time we'll open up, we have a city council work session meeting. Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilman Angeli. Present. Vining. Here. Germaini. Here. Lamore.
Here.
Felder.
Here.
Whitman.
Excused.
Mayor Clark.
Here. And so we have a couple items on the agenda. Mr. Pastu.
Thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to have City Engineer Patrick Lewis go through an item that we didn't get a chance to discuss in the last work session regarding lake and flooding, the engineering report that came along with it. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Okay. Honorable Mayor and Council, Patrick Lewis, Director of Engineering and Public Services. I'll go through this rather quickly just because I know we have a number of other items here, but feel free to stop me, and obviously you may have questions at the end here. I put together a few slides to just show some photographs from the spring's flooding back in 2019. As you well know, we saw extensive flooding this year due to lake effect. Fortunately, the city didn't have the problems that our neighboring townships did, where you had numbers of homes that were inundated multiple times. We did have our share of problems, and we've looked at 3 different, I'll call them areas, with a couple of them being pretty acute. The strong east winds don't help us either, so we had some cases were worse than others. Some of it's just simply where the lake level is in general that's causing the problem. But when you get that strong east wind, even when lake levels are lower, we have seen flooding, particularly in Councilwoman Vining's neighborhood. But this year was worse than we'd seen since I've been here, and that's a little over 20 years. We broke it down, and we actually had this studied from the Spicer Group. Broke it down to 3 different roadway segments, if you will, and understand there's some hybrids of this. There's some smaller segments you could break it down into, but for the most part, we had 3 areas that we were concerned with that are kind of independent storm sewer systems. One of them is East Front Street, and you see a picture of that in front of the wastewater treatment plant. Another one of those I'm calling the Bayview Glenwood area, and that's near the intersection of Bayview and Glenwood was where the worst of the water is because that's the lowest point in that particular subdivision. And then there's another system that goes independently from that's farther to the west. That I'll call that the Conant Wood and Railroad Street system. We saw effects from this starting in about April last year, and they continued on through July, early part of August when the lake started to drop and we didn't have as many east wind events. So we had asked the Spicer Group, who was doing work for us on the St. Mary's Gardens storm sewer project, we asked them to take a look at these three locations, kind of model them, look at the topography of the area, cost out some options for us. One of the things we want to show, and this table doesn't come across nearly as well as I might like it to, but the second one from the bottom is the 100-year chart of Lake Erie. And that shows you the elevations change over that time period. The red line would be the average, and you can see the years that it's above and the years that it's below. Very extreme on the right-hand side is where we are at this point. It doesn't take into account 2020 data just yet. As you can see, for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been trending above average with kind of a spike near the end. That spike is just barely above the spike that you saw in the early 80s. And then again, I think I can't even read this on my copy, so I apologize for that. From about 1973 through about the late 90s, we were above average, and then we had a drop where that drop was pretty pronounced. So you can see that it is cyclical. I don't know whether we're entering a longer term high water cycle or not, and therein lies the $1 million or more than $1 million question in a couple of these cases. Is this a long-term trend? Is this something we're going to see stay around for 10 or 15 years? Is this going to reverse itself? And I can't answer that, but I wanted to show you the data there. In case you're interested, there's the other lakes on there as well. Obviously, Lake Superior doesn't fluctuate as much due to its size. But so then going on to the next one, this chart hopefully is a little more readable. This shows you the trend line of the last couple of years. The purple dots in the middle are the average. And there you can see the feet on the right-hand side, meters on the left. And the blue line represents 2019 data, whereas the red line on top represents 2020 data. The bars, the horizontal bars at top and bottom are the record low and high. And that's for the month. So that's the monthly high and low. And so it doesn't take the absolute high for any day that month, but it takes the monthly average. And for January, we were above where we were in 2019. And they did not adjust. So you may notice the 2019 levels are below the bars. That's because they have not yet adjusted the monthly means for 2019. The new bars in next year's chart will be where the 2019 data was for June, July, and August, because those are above the bars. So you may say, how can we be above the record? Well, they haven't adjusted yet. So looking at the trend line for at least the month of January, where we still have data, we don't have February's data yet, sort of looks like we're in line for the same problem we had last year. Will it be worse or better? I don't know yet. Some of that has to do with the fact that we didn't have much snow this year. But how rainy spring will be is going to have a big difference on that, because the not having ice cover we can have a little more evaporation from the lakes if we don't have ice cover. That could be good. But what it does, though, is this time of year in the February and March, you don't have any ice to keep those waves from breaking on shore. So other areas might get it worse than we do. I don't want to belabor that chart too much, but just to show you that I don't think we're going to have an easier year than we had last year, but let's hope it's not much worse. Here's a few photos from what I would say about the worst of it near East Front Street. And those are, obviously, that's near the wastewater plant again. It got bad enough in a couple occasions that we were marginal about closing the roadway entirely. We're obviously pretty guarded about that, because to do that, we're cutting off access to DTE's power plant. And there are some large profile vehicles, your pickup trucks, that can make it through there. So, in fact, DTE had to shuttle some people in and out on a couple of occasions with their larger vehicles, those that could get in. There's one system that's slightly lower, and that's the one that you're looking at there. That's real near the northbound off-ramp and on-ramp. And we've had times this past spring where we were more than a foot deep there. And I can't tell you how many times for sure it was. There was a 3 or 4 day run when we were continuously in this shape. The picture on the lower left is farther down the road. That's nearer to the plant. As you go east, we don't have quite as many issues, at least at last year's level, which is around 575 feet above sea level, because the road's wide enough, and even though it's a problem with the catch basin, those catch basins are slightly higher than the ones at the wastewater plant. The challenge we have down Front Street is there's a lot of independent systems that go directly to the river. So trying to put flap gates or some other kind of backflow prevention on those means you're going to do it at multiple systems. As opposed to near the wastewater plant, we have several catch basins that come into a common point. We do have Now, I'll get into that when we get into options here in a minute, but we do have a flood control structure in there. Bayview Glenwood is the next independent system. This is, instead of backwater from the river, this is actually backwater from Plum Creek Bay, both of which will be at the same elevation because those are, at this point, both of those are under lake influence. Councilwoman Vining, I'm sure will recognize this area quite well. She looks out her window and can see this. Again, we're talking about roughly a foot of water. It can be a little more, it can be a little bit less. It usually inundates the intersection of Bayview and Glenwood, with the low point being just to the west of that intersection on Bayview. We do generally have to close this intersection when it gets high. Fortunately, in all but the highest flow, there's only a few houses that are cut off entirely. Most of the neighborhood still is accessible through one path. Doesn't make it a direct path, but that's give you some pictures of what you saw in that area. The third system, which I'd say is the least impacted because it's farther west and farther upstream on Plum Creek Bay, is the Conant Avenue run, and that feeds basically Conant, Elmira, and everything west of Fernwood. The first place we start to see water come up is at Conant and Oak. This is a picture taken, I think, the same day as the other photos in Bayview and Glenwood, which means it's not quite as bad. You can still get through here, but what you're seeing is basically the lake water coming back up through the catch basins. So it just happens this is the lowest point. If you add a foot of water to the lake elevation, you add a foot of water to every catch basin in the neighborhood. In some areas, Councilwoman Vining's house, it can just make it that much worse. But what you'll see in other areas is it'll start bubbling up at more locations than we saw it this past year. So that's what we saw. Now, the report summary, and I've got the detailed PowerPoint if you want to go through in more detail Spicer's options, but I don't think we have time tonight. They gave us some options for the Front Street system, and I mentioned that we have it's a double-chambered structure. It's about 6 by 6 on the one chamber. I think it's about 4 by 6 on the other one. It's actually got a flap gate between those two. We found this summer that flap gate was actually inoperable. The gate had fallen off, so that's why we were getting water back through there. We enlisted Solomon Diving, which is a local contractor, to come in and remount that gate, which they did, and we were able to pump from the backside of it back out into the river. It took DPS several days to get it dewatered to the point where the road was totally dry again, and it does feed back into the lagoon across the street. So there are options in dealing with that. However, that gate is leaking. It's not. It needs to be sealed up a little bit better if it's to work. And with the lake elevation, what it is, it's not going to do anything but remain shut. So we would still be required, as it rains and starts to fill the lagoon back up, we'd still have to pump any of the rainwater that came in the street. But at least we'd be not getting the lake water back in. But a couple of options they looked at to make that a fully functioning pump station, where it's basically automatic pumps that come on. We're not going out there feeding it, gassing it up. Ranged from $250,000 for something that's really probably not adequate size, up to close to $1 million, depending on that. It doesn't address any of the other road inlets, though, on Front Street. So I mentioned that there's about 4 or 5 more direct dumps as you go east to the plant, where it's just a single run, 2 catch basins, goes right in the river. It won't address any of those. So if we come up, the whole road is going to be susceptible, and we'd have to look at mounting those in those structures as well. So there's 3 different options, which I can detail a little bit more. You may want to digest this first. Bayview Glenwood system options range from about the same bottom to a little bit higher, $1.1 million. And the reason on that is you've got a very large diameter storm sewer that actually feeds that neighborhood. And the reason that was put in, it traverses almost a half a mile to Plum Creek Bay. And it's pretty big. When I mean it's pretty big, it's like 54 inches diameter in most of the area through there. And the reason it was put in that big is the property south of Bayview was actually intended for industrial development, and it was sized, that storm sewer was sized in the 50s for all that area to be industrial. So we have an oversized storm sewer, which is great, except when you get this lake effect. So we would have to somehow install a pump station, create an actual severing of that line so that we're pumping from one side to the other, kind of like that flood control structure we have at Front Street. Number of different options to look at that, but access is a problem on that one, because the only place we have access to it is real near Councilwoman's house on Bayview and way back in the port property. So you've got to run electrical service back there and some other things. The Conant and Woods system options, those are a little bit easier to deal with, but again, that's the problem. That's the least of our concerns because it only happens 2 or 3 times a year and it doesn't create any isolation. But that one, we think we could get a flap gate on the structure at near Wood and Railroad and probably arrest most of that problem. That's all I really had on the summary report there. We are looking at other, I'll say, more cost-effective solutions because, again, what we're wrestling with administratively is, do we spend these kinds of dollars on something that may 2 or 3 years from now not even be an issue? And that's the danger too. It's not just the danger of letting it continue as it is, but it's the danger of overspending on something that's a cyclical problem.
I'll see if there are any questions, but Mr. Pastu.
I was just going to follow up with, Patrick, and again, although it didn't come across very clear, I certainly distinctly remember back in the mid-'80s, the high water elevations with the Great Lakes and the erosion that went with them, and here we are again. The significance of it was, as Patrick had been with the city over 20 years, wasn't aware there was a flap gate there. And it was installed at that same time period as I would can only surmise in response to the high lake levels. And so I will tell you from an administration standpoint, we're a bit reluctant to make a big investment. We're not dismissing any climate change related items, but is this cyclical and to what extent? So in some ways, we're going to we will continue in many ways trying to address it operationally, at least for the next year or two, and maybe with time we'll have a better handle of what this trend actually is. But I think clearly if you look at the river level, I was driving by it the other day and it's like, holy cow, this thing is remarkably high for this time of the year. And so, if we get the easterly winds, we're going to have problems again. And so I think the significance of it is you've got some cost alternatives, from a capital standpoint, but I would think it's a little premature to make that kind of commitment until we have a better handle on the trend line itself. So. But operationally, we're going to continue to do some of the pumping that we have in a number of areas. So.
Yeah, and we may be approaching you with some smaller dollar costings. Like, for example, I need to hire Solomon and come back in because we think the gate slipped off again. And we'll probably need to get them back in there one more time. And like I said, too, the problem we've got is, it's a math problem. We've got a 42-inch square gate and a round manhole on the top, and the outlet pipe that goes out into the river is a 42-inch round hole. I can't get a 42 square gate through a round hole, so we have to take the top of the whole structure off. So we're going to have to do something where we at least anchor and seal that up. We actually feel better off if we just close that system entirely until the lake levels subside, because the Port Lagoon on the south side of Front Street has tons of capacity, and we can throw in a pump and go from one side of the chamber to the other. We're worse off with the lake than we are with any number of rain events we can have. But we would like to look at another more reliable, newer pump. I think it looks like a WPA vintage that we're using on this. So we may come to you for a couple of tens of thousands of dollars for a couple of pumps that we can use to make our job easier and less maintenance intense by having to fuel this thing 2-3 times a day.
Right there is that the DPS crew is when they were pumping down that lagoon, they're putting gas in frequently during the course of the day. So we may come back with as Patrick alluded to, some higher capacity pumps that can pump a longer duration, so our DPS guys aren't there operating it more frequently.
Questions?
Go ahead, Kelly.
Kelly?
I was thinking about how damaging the water is to the streets. You had to come and remove that first tree in the left-hand corner. That tree died. That had to be removed. We have 2 large trees to the, I think, north, that are clearly dying.
That's the vacant lot.
And so I think that I don't like the idea of delaying a solution because the water is damaging other things, and it's just going to end up costing more if we don't do something. Also, I've never seen DPS pump from here. Is there a reason why they don't pump that water out?
Part of the problem is that there's no physical demarcation between that. At Front Street, there is a gate that at least seals reasonably well, so we can pump from one. Think of it as like a 2 rooms. You're pumping from one room to the next. We don't have that yet on the storm line in your neighborhood. We may look at creating that, and in fact, I may talk to you about gaining access through your property to somehow do that, because there are 2 manholes fairly close together that you could do that. We could basically bulkhead the storm sewer at one of those and pump from one to the other. And if that was the case, if we could actually just put a dam, it would essentially be creating a dam so that nothing can come back from Plum Creek. But the downside is, if you had a heavy rain event, the storm sewers would fill up, and you'd probably fill the road up due to the rain event. But as Mr. Pastu and I have talked about before, I'll roll the dice with a rain event versus the lake coming back in here. And that's really why we haven't been able to do anything, because we just can't, we don't have anywhere to pump it to. It just keeps coming back, and we're just going in a circle there. But we would look for a solution to do that same type of thing, even if it's just a giant balloon we can put in there that'll help dam that up, and then just pump 100 feet from one structure to the next if we had to.
Well, my neighbors and I will certainly give any access that you need. The engineers walk through my yard to get back there. So anything we can do on Bayview and Glenwood, we'd be happy to do. So,
Yeah, thank you, Your Honor. I'll start broad and then I'll go narrow, down detailed. Back in 2017, the Department of Environmental Quality, which is now Eagle, the Office of Great Lakes, and NOAA published a book or a guide called Planning for Community Resiliency in Michigan. And when you read the guidebook, it says that the severity of storms are going to increase. And it's not necessarily that we're looking at necessarily always higher lake levels, but we're looking at the intensity of the storms. So one of the things I'm concerned about is we always look at a very short-term solution to our problems rather than taking a long-term view. So one of the things in your data that interests me was, did the Corps of Engineers or did Spicer kind of do a regression analysis to find out what the trend is for the water levels? Is it continuing higher on a regression? Is it flatline? Because if it's continuing in a higher regression, my suggestion is that we figure out what that elevation is, use our GIS, and then map the areas in the community where we think we're going to have resiliency issues. That's long term, because in the long term, we may need to start working with like FEMA and other agencies on getting grant funds in order to buy these properties and basically just turn these areas into stormwater retention areas long term. Okay, because you can keep throwing the money at it, but with the severity of the storms that they're predicting, we're never going to be ahead of it. Now, the other question I have is, where are you pumping from and where are you pumping to? Because some of these problems it looks like some of the areas here, the elevations may be even lower or equal to the river. No. So where is the water going to be pumped to if the elevations in the street, the pond or the flooding is the same as the river? I'm trying to, can you tell me geographically where the water is going to go?
Well, that's the challenge there. I mean, basically, I don't know how much detail we want to go into this evening, but basically I'll answer the first question. Okay, we'll start with that one. No, they did not do any regression analysis to say where it's going to. That wasn't in Spicer's scope. I'm not aware that the Corps has done anything on that. I attended several meetings back in the spring and summer on it. They didn't give any indication that they had any better idea than the rest of us did about where this is going to shake out. I didn't specifically say, did you do any regression analysis? But we didn't. So it wasn't part of either scope modeling. But your point is well taken.
But part of that issue is, because I've talked to Corps officials before on this, is that they're not going to come out with a forecast because it is counter right now to government policy in Washington to admit that there's an issue with climate change. So EPA and the Corps of Engineers are not going to come out with anything that forecasts any severity in storms, okay? But you have to take a look at the data yourself and come up with those type of you have to look at the data and come up with those localized observations.
Yeah.
But the core information that they are publishing indicates that the water levels for 2020 are going to be at or equal or exceed 2019. Now, they are telling us that.
They are telling us that in general, yes. Where we don't know is where is it going to end up? Because your point's well taken about. I will tell you, if the lake level rose another 2 feet, we've got entire neighborhoods that are going to. I mean, and it's unfortunately it's going to be really one neighborhood because of its proximity to the lake. So we haven't done any cost benefit analysis on property acquisition. We have batted around the idea of acquiring a strategic property or two that could be used to create a detention area. But the problem is when it's lower than, when the ground around the detention area is still lower or nearly as low as the lake, that's not really going to work either. The pumping from and to is really just, like I said, on the Front Street side, it's the road catch basins are at, let's say, 575 feet above sea level, but the top of bank on the first cut of the river may be 578. So as long as the water's not coming over the top of bank, the road system can still be kept dry, whereas the water level, until it gets up to cresting over the bank, won't be impacting the road. What you have to deal with is any rainwater that gets into the storm system, pumping that back over the top of this flood control structure back into the river. As far as Councilwoman Vining's neighborhood, it would be much the same thing. The land comes up again as you go towards Plum Creek, so there's a ridge there. It's not like her neighborhood's at 575 and it continues all the way to Plum Creek Bay at 575. Otherwise, the whole thing would be full of water. But it would basically be as long as you can sever that storm system so that you're essentially creating a closed storm system is what you'd be doing at that point. But as I've said, and Mr. Pastu and I have had that conversation, we'll take our chances that, okay, we got 3 inches of rain last night. We're starting to get a little water bubbling up in your neighborhood. Get the pumps out, pump it from one structure to the next where we've got a physical blockage, go from one to the next, and then we've drained the rainwater. We can do that 6, 7, 8 times a year when we get those heavy storms because the storm system will detain some in the pipes just based on its size. It's a pretty big system. So if we were to catch it far enough downstream, we could pump across that. And that's what we have in mind for the short-term solution, only because one, some of the long-term solutions require the permits from the Army Corps, which means we certainly aren't going to get those done in time for this year. We couldn't have gotten those done in time for this year had we started in July or August. But so we're probably stuck with the short-term solutions for as much as they're solutions for one more year. The question becomes, at what level, at what point do we think the investment requires us to do something to this part of the system, or as you mentioned, consider alternatives such as simply, I don't want to say admitting defeat, because that's essentially what we'd be doing, saying we're losing the battle against the floodwaters. We're going to have to pursue purchase of certain properties that are constantly getting flooded. And I'm not saying that might not be where we find ourselves.
Well, if I may, Your Honor, Patrick and I have had discussion about, detention basins for that specific purpose. Again, comes at a cost and, certainly in how you design it and capacity and what have you. So, but we didn't push, we just kind of looked at some of these initial items here to see what potentially it would be. I'm intrigued with the regression aspect of it, but to see what that trend line is, and as you said, using our GIS to try and map what the impacts would be. Again, our engineers could calculate what capacity we would need based on the forecast, and so it's just something we can carry forward if the council's still interested in it. But I think this is where we're at with it right now. Is we're going to try and make the best of what we got for at least this next year. And
yeah, we're not sitting on our hands by any stretch,
Yeah.
but it's difficult to commit to this level of expenditures.
Go ahead.
I'll see if there's other questions. I think before I say that, there's clearly we know it's not going to go away. We really anticipate there'll be more, and obviously there's going to have to be some options. And while we have in front of us from last year know what it is, I think the point's well taken that we may have other areas that are also impacted if we have these significant rises, but we have to take care of what's in front of us too now. Brian, and then I'll come back around.
I was just going to hit on that as far as the other places being impacted. Our major industry is right down there in the port, DTE, Van Tower, and Gerdau. If we add another foot or 2 foot to the level, where are they looking at?
We have significant problems getting access, if not to the heavy vehicles that can have this much clearance, but at least to the worker that's got to get to those plants. And one option that I haven't even talked about, you may find yourself in a position where rather than trying to retrofit 4 or 5 or 6 flap gates on all these storm structures, you're better off raising the road 2 feet. I mean, that's a solution, a potential solution in the port area. It's not so much a potential solution where you have residences, because you can't have the road be 2 feet higher in the front door because it's not solving the problem for the residents.
Well, what about the industry themselves? What about Gerdau? I mean, where are they at level-wise?
Most of
Structure-wise.
those properties are high enough that it would take probably a more catastrophic rise. I'd have to look at that. I want to say that Gerdau and DTE especially are at least 5 feet above the road with the building elevation, but I can't say that for sure. I'd have to go back and look at the data, but I think it's significant enough that we're likely to have a host of other problems before we get to where those buildings themselves are unusable. Because obviously DTE taking their flagship plant out of commission is not an option for anybody.
John?
Patrick. One is, in terms of future, is there an opportunity to, what's the procedure to get with FEMA to start taking a look at changing the floodplain zones based on the amount of flooding that we're having?
Actually are in the middle of, and you'll see this within the next 3-4 months, FEMA just remapped the coastal areas. The mayor got a copy of
They're
it too.
sitting on my desk. They came in this morning.
The maps come in?
Yes, they did.
Oh, good. I've been waiting for those because I can't bring them to council until we have the maps, but they actually did remap the coastal areas to include a new wave zone, and that was basically to account for what we're seeing. Now, I can tell you the maps didn't change the 100-year flood contours for anything west of I-75 because you're not going to get wave action that far west, but I think it probably will impact marginally those industries, but again, I think they're high enough that their main buildings are above those contours.
But I thought your concern here was that when we have an easterly wind, it backs the lake up, which is a wave action, which then raises some of the impacts that we're seeing here relative to flooding. So,
Sewers, if you can believe that.
okay, but still, I mean, this is flooding. I mean,
Yeah.
can we make the argument to them that some of these areas should be included in the 100-year floodplain?
If we can convince them to map ironically, the 2000 maps, year 2000 maps, actually showed the Bayview Glenwood area in the 100-year floodplain, and then they changed their policy that they don't map backwaters through enclosed storm systems. So those came out of the requirements for flood insurance. So can we? Yes. It'll be several years before we can effectuate that
but-
because of the glacial pace they move on
I
remapping.
understand that, but again, that's a future action.
And for grant funding, we would need to do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
The second question I have is, where are we at? I know that council had a presentation several years ago on revisions to the I-75 interchange. And if that proceeds, what impact will that have on flooding? Because now you're going to be changing the ramps and the whole interchange. So what's the impact there?
Vince, I don't know if you want to field that one, or if we're not far enough along the
Yeah,
process, I guess, to know for sure.
And I think that I will tell you, Front Street's traffic flow will be altered significantly. I don't think you'd see the same level of volume of traffic other than to the plants themselves with smaller vehicles, but the truck traffic would probably not be going through where the flooded area is. But part of I think, is it the NEPA process would have to do that evaluation as to what the impact would be with that alignment. We're continuing to consider going a little further east or west, I'm sorry, on the Front Street ramp than what was initially proposed, given that there is some property on Front Street that has had an option for purchase from the port. So, but that area right there immediately there is the one that we'd have to look at a little closer.
We could leverage it to our advantage, is maybe what you were getting at.
Well, that and the other part is part of the design, which I know that's down the road.
Yeah.
Is interchanges take up a lot of acreage. Is there any area within the interchange that's typically just nothing but grass and a pit that we could actually design into stormwater collection areas within the interchange?
Oh, I'm certain that would be the case. Yeah, I'm sure that would be the case. Now, I don't know, again, back to the lake levels, if it's back feeding from the lake, you can make it as deep as you want to, and the lake's pretty big, so no matter how deep we dig it, it's not gonna lower that lake level. It'd still just be responding to
No, I'm
whatever the
talking
lake.
about these issues here, places to pump the water to. Yeah.
I mean, anything's possible, and I think that is a great opportunity to do that as part of that process. But we're, again, back to the long term. It's clearly a long term project. It's a long term solution. I think we've got some long term options, and hopefully to work them in there so that we're not the ones stuck holding the check entirely.
Thank you.
Other questions for Andrew?
Go back to the slide that shows the lake levels over time briefly. The previous one.
Certainly.
My EKG.
Yeah.
Well, I tried to isolate this and blow it up, but it just doesn't.
So if I'm reading this right, it looks like the peaks are about 10 years apart mostly,
Uh,
Average, you're right.
roughly, very roughly.
yeah, from 1999 through about 2014. Yeah, maybe a little bit. From 1999 to about 2014, it was very close to average. So we had a period of relative calm for about 15 years in there. It was slightly below average, but we did have spikes that were above the average there, and then it took off again. But it's not unlike how it took off in the late 70s either. If you see that trend is pretty similar to what we're seeing today, and then you had a quick decline. And ironically, again, this is the case for not doing anything too quickly. In 1985, that flood control structure was installed. And I actually talked to my predecessor, and he said, yeah, that was why it was installed. We got a grant from, I think it was the Army Corps to do it. But in 1987, lake levels dropped precipitously, and then it was no longer needed. So for a period of going on 35 years, it wouldn't have been anything. And frankly, I'm a little embarrassed to say I didn't know about it. But again, we're back to we didn't have any reason to know about it. It was irrelevant. Storm system was working. Everything was getting out, and we were cleaning it, but we didn't know that structure existed. So again, not trying to advocate doing nothing, but it's, if I'm going to come to you with recommendation to spend $1 million up to $1 million in one location, I prefer to have a little more certainty that what we're seeing is a long-term trend, so I'm not steering you that direction unnecessarily.
And that's sort of, I say that to say this, that it's roughly two scenarios, that either 2020 is going to be the peak of this and it's going down from there, or that 2020 is just the beginning and it's only getting worse from there. In either case, it seems like the improvements that we're going to make only are going to cover a narrow range and help us, as long as we fall into this variance outside the mean. If it's going to be less than that for 10 years following 2020, then we're going to have this infrastructure sitting there that isn't really helping us and doing us any good. And when it's going to be needed again, we're probably going to need to update it anyway because it's so old, or the problem's going to get so bad that what we put in now with whatever investment we make is going to be insufficient to address the problem.
That's almost, at this point, that's what's keeping me more awake at night, is that scenario that we've overbuilt and then it's still not adequate 10, 15 years down the road.
Take a look at the graph. When you go to the very left, what's the date? Is that
1918.
18?
Yep.
Take a look at 1918 and then go all the way to the right. And look at how high Lake Erie has become in 2020. Okay? And then between 1972 to 1999, almost 2000, there was an area of almost 30 years in there where the lake levels were way higher than the average for Lake Erie.
Yeah, that's right.
So to me, if they ran, I'm looking at this and thinking, whoa, if you ran a regression analysis, you're going to find that that's a fairly steep, that's a fairly good incline, which tells you that in the future, this thing is going to keep getting higher.
Well, and I don't know that we have a real good idea what it was like 200 years ago, but I know this area is referred to as the Black Swamp when people first came across. And so is it possible that swamp crept much farther inland than it does today? It's very possible. So
Well,
I don't want to say it's not possible that we could be in for a higher elevation. It's just we're here with the data we've got and trying to make a fairly sizable capital improvements recommendation that, as you correctly pointed out, may not even be adequate depending on where that ends up.
Yeah.
So
Andrew?
Thank you, sir. Do the scenarios that you've provided, the costs for the scenarios that you provided include raising road levels and reinforcing banks, or are they only for the pump stations
Only for
and
the
the
pump
flat
station
stations?
improvements for the most part, yeah.
Okay.
And I think that's part of what we're getting at is, obviously we see it's here and we don't anticipate it's going to be less and potentially could be more, is what's the immediate item that addresses some of the neighborhoods, and we are doing a short term, but there's definitely a long-term plan that has to be here, not just for the next 3 years, but the next 10 years. If it's a continuation of some of this graph here that shows there's a long term. And, we'll have to, it's definitely going to have to be a continued discussion with the council.
Yeah, and my
But
concern
we'll
too,
look forward to what some of those options and cost analysis are.
the other concern I have too is if the lake level goes up another foot or two, the bad thing is I'd like to say we could get some grant funding to do some of this, but I also know what our neighbors are going to be dealing
same
with.
thing.
And we're going to be playing second fiddle to that because at this point where we had beach areas, and especially Bowles Harbor area, where you had whole neighborhoods that were inaccessible, we had a block that was inaccessible. And so if the funding does come from somewhere, I have a feeling we're not going to be on the high end of that. Now, if it starts to threaten DTE, then there may be that may be a different story. But I wouldn't hold out too much hope that they're going to come riding to the rescue, at least right away.
Okay, I know Andrew has another question, and I know we have another item too. Andrew?
Just a clarifying question, I'll try and make it brief. At the front street, at the front street intersection near the 75, it seems like we at least have some infrastructure there in which to combat the issue when
Yes.
it occurs.
Yes.
Conversely, in the neighborhoods, it seems like no such infrastructure exists by which we can even attempt to combat the issue when it occurs.
That's correct.
So it seems like we almost might have different approaches for each of those. One's, you can an intermediate solution might, in this case, be optimal. Usually I'm, short-term costs for long-term savings, but this, because we want to wait and see what happens, you might want to just do a short-term, an interim solution. But in the neighborhoods, we have no capacity to respond to the problem, and that might demand a different.
Yeah, it probably will.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a very good way to
Where
put
I'm
it.
at.
Well, the question, Kelly?
Capital improvement millage you were talking about, would this type of work be something we could use that for?
We'll defer that to the city manager.
If, I would, part of it is thinking more for residential related street improvements, but would include stormwater. So there may be, for example, in the residential area, maybe something that would be considered. The Front Street I-75 interchange, I'm not sure, based on how I would recommend that you put the village proposal together, would not, meet that eligibility.
There's no other questions?
Do our best to try to make this as minimal an issue as we can for the spring, but I can't promise you it won't be an issue at all.
Director.
Mr. Pastor, you had one other item, just a review of any meeting items, and then maybe a comment also?
I'll ask Mr. Lewis to stand up at the podium still. We have two items on the regular agenda tonight that we wanted to talk with you. The first being the Bates Drain Resolution assessment, and then the other is with the Labor Park lighting contract with DTE. So I'll let you start with the Bates.
Sure.
Just a quick explanation of what it is. And
I don't know how many of you are familiar with the way the County Drain Commissioner's Office does petition projects. Typically, 5 landowners are supposed to petition a full-blown clean-out, and they can do that. And then that goes through a formal day of review or a board of determination to determine the necessity of the project. There's another way you can do projects too, and if it falls under $5,000 a mile, the Drain Commissioner doesn't have to seek approval from anyone. He can expend that fund on a per mile basis and then just charge the property owners on a pro rata basis based on their acres of land and some other factors that go into that. Where you exceed, we're in a project for Bates Drain, which kind of runs from near the intersection of Bentley and Elm, kind of northwest through Custer Airport, and it terminates just west of Bates Lane. They've got a few clean out things that aren't a full-blown clean out, and then jetting the tile where it goes, it's tile most of the way through the city. They've estimated the cost about $45,000. They can do it a third way of not having to go through a formal board of determination if the two governing bodies representing the territory approve a resolution that says, we don't object to you assessing more than $5,000 per mile. So the total cost about $45,000 for 2 to 2.5 miles. I don't have an exact footage. And that would be spread against all the landowners. I put in the resolution. The resolution has the city's costs, which are around $11,000. We have the two biggest tracts of land in there, Custer Airport and Munson Park, as well as an at-large share of, which every city gets an at-large share just based on the way the drain code's set up. And there's a share for our roadways, because the roadways shed water into those drains as well. Our property owners will be getting assessments, but it's a pretty low number. I didn't have the exact one at press time. I estimated between $100 and $200. Deputy Drain Commissioner told me, we don't have them figured yet, but that's about the right range. And that would just be a one-time assessment, and that is I'll call it a heavy maintenance cleaning, not a full-blown clean out, because it doesn't require that. So rather than spend the extra 30, 35, 40% going and getting a board of determination together, noticing all the residents, spending those additional costs and then having to spread those, it makes sense, given a relatively small assessment, to do it this way. So.
Questions for council? I do have it on the consent agenda. I thought we should probably just at least give you a little background on it. We're recommending just to go along with.
So I have a question, Patrick. So this came to the drain commissioner for action. How did this initiate? And I'm just curious. I see the map. I can see where it starts. I can see where it ends.
An upstream landowner raised issues of poor drainage on their property.
Farm property.
That would be my understanding of the situation.
Okay. So, and I don't have a problem with that, because obviously we just talked about water and where it sits and where it impacts people's lands and where they reside. So I'm assuming they're going to do is they're going to do a clean out upriver, similar to what we've seen elsewhere? I know we talked about that as a council here as well.
No, I don't believe so, because you'll never be able to do it for those dollars. I think there are a few isolated obstructions. I think they already expensed some of it maintenance-wise, just cleaning out plugs, things like that. Somebody will throw a couch in the drain, they got to pull that out. And then sometimes maybe there'll be a bank that'll collapse in one location. They just have to dig a little bit of that out. My understanding is that's the type of project scope we're looking at, is just spot maintenance on the upstream open sections and jetting of the tile. It hasn't been jetted fully I don't think since I've been here.
Okay. So other part of my question for that is, I know that it's been 3 years now. Mason Run, I think, had some work done. And of course, when that was done, and it's up river as well, and there's a lot of farmland, there were some specific locations where you started to increase the green algae coming down the river that came through the city and into the river that then goes into the lake. So I just want to know what type of work was going to be done.
Yeah.
I understand the drains need to be cleaned. I know they need to be cleared as well. But I just also hope that as we proceed through this, that we monitor what comes down the river. And if there's an increase for that, then there's other actions we need probably to have conversations about with the drain commissioner, as well as upriver what comes down.
I will convey those concerns to the drain commissioner, but my understanding is that it will not be anything resembling with the wholesale tree removal and that type of stuff. That's just kind of opening up some clogged areas.
Yeah, which sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
John?
Patrick, I didn't see, maybe I missed it in the fact sheet. Where is the city's portion of the funding coming from? What fund in the city?
General fund.
Yeah, we didn't actually, I don't think I actually set it aside. I think it's eligible. Some of it is eligible from the street fund. Theoretically, some of it's eligible from the airport fund, but that fund typically doesn't have any money. It usually requires a subsidy from the general fund anyway. Some of it's eligible from the street funds though as well, particularly the portion of runoff from the roadways themselves.
Given the fact that it's $11,000, I'd recommend just to take it out of the general fund.
Okay.
Just as
I
a one-time.
didn't see it in there.
I think I gave the finance director the authority to determine the proper. I didn't grab that with me, so I apologize. I don't have it in front of me.
Okay. Not a problem.
I think you had another item, Vince, you wanted just to review?
The other item is the Labor Park lighting contract with DTE. We'll go quickly with this, Patrick.
Yes, we had, we need to make some amendments to this, so we'll need to pull this from consent. just because there was an error in the number of lights going back. But basically, with Labor Park, we're taking out the old street lights. As you know, we're abandoning the piece of Second Street between Winchester and Eastchester. So we're taking down the overhead street lights in that area, replacing those with decorative lights. Some will be in the same corridor because the parking lot's going to abut what used to be Second Street, or what currently is Second Street. But there'll also be a few more decorative lights in the park. So there's 2 agreements on here, actually there's 4 agreements on here, because at the time which we put this together, we hadn't yet selected the pole type. But we do have the removal agreement is for removal of those 6 lights, 5 poles, and then one of those lights is getting relocated from one pole that's staying to a new location. Those will be the ones that'll be on the perimeter, so the relocated one's going to be on the street. All the new lights are going to be decorative options. I gave you the 3 contracts because I literally got this Thursday morning when we were preparing the agenda, and we really wanted to get it moving so we could get the poles ordered. Problem was, so there's 3 agreements in here. One is for a Washington Post light, which is the exact same model we got for the Winchester Street Bridge. But there are 2 other options for their stock product, which is a HAPCO product. And I didn't have cut sheets or anything to include on that one. Mark Russell and I have looked at it, and we don't think there's a discernible difference. And so for the cost differential, it's around $15,000 and change for 6 of those lights. So we'd recommend going with that. But in the fact sheet, I asked for council authority to spend up to the $22,000. Where we have to make the amendment is, when we sat down with this and started going through light by light, Mark and I realized there's not 6 lights, there's 16 lights that are going back. We actually were able to remove a few of those that we thought were actually pretty redundant and didn't look right. There was going to be one right in front of the library door, for example. So we were down to 12 lights, and both of us are comfortable that will take care of what we need to see there. But DTE needs to revise the agreement and give us a new cost on that. So
It's
new decorative lights.
With the 6, not counting the 6.
Those 6 are coming down. One of them is going to get relocated to
Right.
to another pole in the road. So you're going to be net. It'll be net 7 new lights.
6 Hadco and 6 Washington poles. That's 12.
We're not using the Washington poles. We're gonna do. I gave you all 3 agreements for the different dollar costs in there.
Okay, so you're,
So I guess what
the fact sheet says the first option is the Hadco and the second option is the Washington Post. So you're going to go all Hadco and do 12 poles?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now,
The idea.
Mark is comfortable with this because fiberglass poles, in terms of maintenance, long-term maintenance, can become an issue.
The cut sheet actually shows those as aluminum.
So the Hadco are not going to be fiberglass; they're going to be aluminum.
That's what their cut sheet shows. That's correct.
Okay, so in here in the fact sheet it says fiberglass.
Yeah, and then when we got the cut sheet in Friday morning, this is the problem when we have to do stuff last minute. And I was well aware that I was going to be standing here having to defend why I've given you half information. But we wanted to get it on the agenda because we want to keep the process moving here. And frankly, it's been very slow getting information from DT. So
Are the Hadco poles? Because you didn't have I tried finding it online. I couldn't find it online. Are the Hadco poles? Do they look like the Washington pole?
I can show you what they look like.
But your observation. Are they?
Yeah, they look pretty similar.
Okay, because we have the Washington poles are also used downtown, aren't they?
Yes, but not by the same manufacturer. These are the Washington Post, a Holophane product.
That's a Holophane product.
Yeah, the Sternberg is the ones we have on First Street, and then we have the Spring City poles from the 82 and 84 streetscape phases.
Okay, I just was curious that we're going to end up with all these different looking poles.
Yeah.
Are we?
Slightly, yes. The one that's the most consistent with what we've done recently on the bridges would be the Washington Post at the higher cost, but we would be also required to stock an additional post in case of a knockdown.
Well, I guess and I understand there's cost implications, but I'm looking, I guess, bigger picture. Labor Park is within the area of the is part of the Heritage East corridor. And doesn't it make sense that when we put up lights or any type of furnishings, that they're all consistent? So we don't have different light styles in the same area that we're trying to build consistency with.
It may not be in the corridor plan exactly, but it's adjacent to. And I think what the councilman's saying is if we know what the corridor plan is and where the buffers that go around it. So his point is, should it be same, similar, or like?
If you want my personal opinion, I think it would be Personally, I would prefer just sticking with the Washington Post because that's what we picked on the last 3 projects we've done. Rosler Bridge, Winchester Bridge, and the North Monroe Street streetscape. Those have all been Washington Posts.
So, go ahead.
If that's the desire of council, we can come back at the regular meeting when we have to ask to have this item pulled, and Patrick can give you a cost for both alternatives. And
Is
that
that
way,
going to be a time issue?
oh no,
What we'd have to do to get the 12 poles, because again, these agreements are predicated on 6 poles, not 12, is it's $22,277 for the Washington Post for 6 of them. DTE is they were supposed to get me back today with the revised for 12, with the understanding it's not just as simple as doubling the number, because there's additional cabling that might have to go on.
So listen to the city manager. I'll see what council thinks as well. You know, we're trying to make a decision on facts we have now. What may change tomorrow. I think if it is pulled from the agenda, if that's council's desire, we at least would get a full answer at the next meeting of not only the style but the cost, and then we can look at where it is adjacent to the corridor, all those items.
Your Honor, and I'll just throw this out, don't want to complicate things, but I do know that Edison makes a load of money off of their streetscape lighting because we pay for it and we pay for it forever in our municipal lighting bill. Have you guys run the numbers if the city were to buy the lights and just have the contractor install them, and all we do is buy the power from Edison through a meter? We don't buy the lights through them. We just buy them because it used to be that the break-even point between buying your own lights and using Edison was about 8 to 9 years, and after that, they were paid off. But with Edison, you're going to pay that monthly charge that goes into our municipal lighting bill from today for the next 50 years, as long as those lights are still up.
The short answer is no, we haven't looked into that. And part of the reason we haven't looked into it is that long-term staffing levels and long-term expertise of staff to be able to manage that lighting system is probably going to be a bigger challenge than anything. I have a master electrician on DPS's staff right now, and that's the only master electrician that I have. And so when that position goes away, if that position has to go away, if it's one of them that we cut back in the future, we're saddling ourselves with another
I
maintenance
understand
problem.
your argument there, but I'm not trying to minimize it, but a light pole is a pole. It is ballast, and it's the luminaire, and it's the globe. And any electrical contractor, commercial contractor, can easily service those lights. So I'm just saying, every time we buy a light from Edison, we are paying for it from the day that we buy it until the day that it comes out of the ground. And it could cost a lot of money.
If that's an option we want to look into, we'll have to move fast on it because we're ready to roll.
you know, in the short run, you know, this may be in order to move the project forward with Labor Park, continue with working with DTE. Candidly, we're going to have to look at our street lighting, given our long-term revenue. We're paying a lot of money for street lighting. There's no disagreement from city administration there, but in the interest of moving forward with it for this project, I'd suggest that we continue that relationship with DTE, at least for this project.
Should we decide to pull the installation contract, I would like to request that we keep the removal contract on there because we can get that work scheduled quickly. They'd like to start performing that work in the next few weeks. So if we are going to pull it for another council meeting, which may be probably the way to go at this point, given the confusion on it, the removals should be pretty clean. That's pretty straightforward, and I can get DT going on that.
Reading the council, I think that's probably what we're looking at. I think it'd be helpful. Plus, we're clear why we're getting what we're going to end up with as well. But I do understand your point of wanting to continue to move forward because we do have a project with Labor Park. So we don't want to have delayed because it's looking for that completion this year. I think there's, and we'll think about that as we get into the next meeting and the break before the council meeting to see what it is that look to Mr. Pastou for some thoughts on that as we make motions for that item.
Appreciate the discussion. Appreciate the questions.
All right, thanks, Patrick. Mr. Pastou?
I have nothing else for the work session. I got a couple items I'll talk about during the regular meeting.
Okay.
Yep.
There's no others. I know we have yet another follow-up.
If Your Honor, I'll make a motion that we go into,
If I can, because
Yeah.
I'll plan on bringing it up during the meeting regardless. I'm looking through the capital improvements budget that's been proposed. There is still an appropriation on there for the police station viability study. I know that we had dissolved the committee that was exploring that. I'm fine if we still want to pursue that, but it just seems to conflict with other information that we've been given. And I think that that change has happened since we looked at this in work session last.
Well, I will say we dissolved the committee as much as we haven't formed the committee.
Yes,
Because
that would be
there's
more
the
accurate.
discussion
My
of
apologies.
where we're gonna go, and we didn't have persons for comments, but I'll see if Mr. Pastu has a comment to this.
If I may, Your Honor, if we could, I would recommend just leaving it in there. It is a planning document. The actual appropriation would take place with the proposed budget that would be coming up here, that council will be considering here later this spring. So it is
So
a
just to
planning.
explore what it would look like if we were to
Exactly,
pursue
yeah.
that in the future.
Yep, yep.
The funding source is listed as the capital project bond advancement with the assumption that we're doing a bond.
That would be correct. And
Following it up with a bond, would that still be an appropriate allocation?
ultimately, I
Disperse it
think it
from?
would be reimbursed, but clearly you'd advance it with other funds, the first phase of it, and much like what we did with the fire station with some of the preliminary work.
Okay, yeah, all right.
Good question.
Thank you for the clarification.
Yep. Other comments? If not, I think Councilman Akalanji.
Make a motion, Your Honor, that we go into closed executive session for review of attorney-client privilege correspondence.
I think we have to close the work session, correct? And then we have to call the special meeting. Is that correct?
Correct, Your Honor,
Okay.
yes.
So at this time, it's no other questions for the work session. Close the work session, and I'm gonna catch up with the paperwork as well. We have a special meeting, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so, thanks, clerk. So at this time, we'll open the special meeting regarding closed executive session. Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilperson Akawangeli? Vining? Jermaine? Lamore? Felder? Whitman?
Excused? Here, Councilman Akalanji?
Motion, Your Honor, that we go into closed executive session for the review of attorney-client privilege correspondence.
Akalanji, supported by Councilman Lamore. All in favor?
All in favor's fine.
Okay, all in favor? Say aye. Aye. Thank you. Opposed? We'll be adjourned for a period. Got that all through.
It's good pick up on that.